Anthropic just fixed the biggest problem with MCP servers in Claude Code. Just a few days ago, I posted this video breaking down how connecting MCPs directly to Claude Code degrades performance and consumes your context window. This video did surprisingly well, so I can see that this issue really resonated with you guys. I also open sourced and shared this tool that I built for solving this called the MCP Launchpad, which basically allowed Claude Code to search for tools without preloading tool definitions into the context window. And thousands of you have been using this and even contributing to this project. So I just really want to say thank you guys. Now, I was sure that it would only be a matter of time before Anthropic addressed this because we had been dealing with the problem for so long. This GitHub issue for lazy loading MCP servers has been open since July of 2025, and I know a lot of people were implementing their own workarounds. Well, Anthropic heard the community, and 2 days ago, they shipped Claude Code with a new MCP Search Tool that works really similarly to the MCP Launchpad, just better. Now, Claude Code no longer preloads all of the MCP tool definitions into the context window. Instead, Claude Code will now search for specific tools only when it needs them. And I've been using Claude Code with the new MCP Search Tool over the last 2 days since it came out, so I wanted to show you how it works and also share what I've learned while testing it. Before we dive in, I wanted to address two things that came up over and over in the comments of my previous video, which was this idea that you could hide the MCP tool definitions behind skills or subagents and get around this problem of context bloat from MCP tool definitions. For skills, we know that they work using progressive disclosure where the skill contents is only going to be read once Claude decides to use that skill. And in the skill front matter, you can define what tools are allowed. But the thing is, if you have MCP tools in a skill, they're still connected to the main Claude code, whether a skill employs them or not, meaning all of the tools are still loaded into Claude's context window. And it's the same thing with subagents. In subagents, you can restrict what tools subagents have access to. But again, any MCP tools that you give a subagent will by definition be connected to Claude Code's context window. A lot of you also mentioned Docker MCP Toolkit and how this solved the context bloat problem for MCP tools. I really enjoy using MCP Toolkit. It's super easy to configure. But unless I'm missing something, it actually doesn't solve this problem. I configured my MCP Toolkit here with these 6 MCP servers. And to connect it to Claude Code is super easy. I just have to go to the Client tab and then connect to Claude Code, which you can see I already did. Now what this does is just add Docker's MCP gateway to your MCP configuration. So I have it open here. This is my .claude.json. It only has one entry. It just adds this MCP Docker. And so I think maybe this is where the confusion lies, where it looks like it's only adding one server that is somehow going to efficiently connect to tools only as they're needed. But I can show you how this actually works within Claude Code. So I'll head over to this test project where I don't really have anything in here, just some stuff I'm testing. This claude.md is empty. And I'm going to go over to my console and just start up Claude. I'm going to do /MCP just to show you that the MCP Docker is the only thing I have connected. I'm just going to go back to Claude and then type /context. Here, you're going to see all of the tools that are in my actual MCP servers. Here's the context usage. All of those tool definitions have in fact been loaded into the context window. So they're now taking up 22,000 tokens or 11% of the context window. So this is still a big issue, right? The more MCP servers you add, the more of your context window you're going to take up. All right, so I'm back in my test project and I disconnected the MCP toolkit. So now if I go to my Claude Code and do /MCP, no MCP servers are currently configured. So let's take a look at the context. I have some plugins, some skills, but my context window is super clean here. I have no MCP servers configured and 135,000 or 68% almost of free space. So let's see what this looks like when I connect my MCPs. So here I have this MCP file. I have render, Sentry, Supabase, Vercel, Linear, Obsidian, and Context 7. So 7 MCP servers in total. And I'm just going to rename this now so that Claude can pick it up. So I'm going to close that old one and we'll open a new one here. What you'll see now, this is updated with the new MCP Search Tool. So once you upgrade your Claude Code to 2.17, you should have this new MCP Search Tool. Since I loaded the MCP servers, there's now this warning saying that there's invalid settings and it's telling me to run Docker. So if I do that, basically what's happening is these warnings are because it's detecting that I have large MCP tool context. Across all of these MCP servers, I'm consuming 36,000 tokens, and that's over this limit that it suggests of 25,000 tokens. So that's why I'm getting that warning. Now I want to do a /context so we can see the MCP servers are all connected now. And a lot of our context window is taken up. So now we're consuming around 36,000 tokens or 18% of the total context window. So before we've even sent our first message, we now have less than 100K of free space. Not only that, but of course we are polluting the entire context window with potentially a bunch of irrelevant MCP tool definitions. If we go back to the original announcement, I'm not exactly sure based on this wording how it's supposed to work, but they say Claude Code will detect when your MCP tool descriptions would use more than 10% of the context. When triggered, tools are loaded via search instead of preloaded. Now, I don't know how they're calculating this 10% of context. From reading this, it makes it seem like it would be on a per tool basis, but that doesn't quite make sense because there are literally no tools that are going to take up 10% of your context on their own. So maybe they mean for the entire MCP server, or maybe they mean across all MCP servers. I don't know. It's not clear, but if you just update your Claude Code and run it out of the box with all of these MCP tools connected, it's still going to preload them into your context window. So it's not doing the lazy loading by default. In order to enable lazy loading of tool definitions and not preload all of these MCP tools like this, we have to actually turn on a setting in Claude Code. So you're going to want to go over to your .claude folder. If you don't have it in your project, you can just create this folder and name it .claude. And then inside of it, we're going to modify this settings.json. And again, if you don't have this yet, then you can just create one. In here, you're going to add just one more variable for the env setting, and it's going to look like this with another setting called enable tool search, and you're going to want to set this to true. So this is just an override setting to ensure that tool search is always on and always used by Claude, and it's going to disable that automatic preloading of MCP tool definitions. Now you can set that here like we just did at the project level, or you could do it at the user level. As I mentioned in the last video, you're just going to want to go to your username, which should be similar on Windows, and then enable the hidden folders option, which is Shift Command period. And you're going to go into your .claude folder, and these are global settings. So if you enable it here, it'll always be on for all of your projects, no matter where you use Claude Code. In this folder, there's also a settings.json, and so you can enable it there if you want to make it global. Coming back to Claude Code, let's see what this context looks like now that we enabled that setting. So I'm going to start up a new Claude, and it should pick up the new setting. So I'll do /MCP just to confirm that all of the MCP servers are still connected and wait for them to load. And then we'll do a /context. So this time, as we scroll up, you can still see the MCP servers here. And you might notice it's subtle, but they are grayed out a bit. Actually, we can just flip over to see how they were here. So here you can see that they have tokens next to them and they're a little bit brighter. Now, after we change that setting, the tokens are gone and they're a little bit grayed out. If we scroll all the way to the top, we'll see now this new indication that these are being loaded on demand. And more importantly, you check the context usage, and sure enough, it has been freed up. We no longer have any MCP tools taking up context, and our free space has gone back up to 135,000. Another thing I want to point out is the system tools. These system tools take up 16.8 thousand tokens, or 8.4%. This is with the MCP Search Tool. And if I go to the previous Claude where we had the setting off, you'll notice this is only 16.2 or 8.1%. So it's slightly less than what we have here. And that's because of the MCP Search Tool now being enabled and added as a system tool. So what does the MCP Search Tool actually look like? I took this trace of a conversation I had earlier with Claude just to show you what the MCP tool actually looks like and the mechanism for how it works. So these are all of the default tools that Claude Code has. You have a couple of MCPs down here, but here you can see this new MCP Search Tool. So this is that additional context that's now being loaded into the context window. The description says, search for or select MCP tools to make them available for use. Mandatory prerequisite, this is a hard requirement. You must use this tool to load MCP tools before calling them directly. Okay, there are two ways to use this MCP search tool. The first one is through direct selection. So if it uses this syntax where it says select : and then the name of the tool, it's going to return just that tool if it exists. The second way it can search is using keyword if it's not sure which tool it actually wants to use. So it can use plain language search terms or keyword search terms like list directory, read file, Slack message. And this is going to work a little differently. This is going to return up to 5 matching tools that are ranked based on relevance. Now, either way, both of these mechanisms are through this same search tool. Once it gets the full tool definition back from the search tool, it can then call the tool like it normally would. So here are some examples of correct and incorrect usage patterns. These first two correct usage patterns show you using the different query methods. So MCP search using the select method where it's calling a specific tool. And then once it gets back the full tool definition and schema and understands how to use it, it can then call the tool. With the second method, it can just query using a keyword like Slack. It'll get back several tool definitions, including the most likely correct tool for this query, which is to read a channel. And then it can, again, call that tool like it would normally directly. And then the incorrect pattern is instead of doing the search first, it just directly calls the tool. Now, after those examples, you'll see that we actually have the full list of MCP tool names. There's no description of the tool. There's no input requirements or usage patterns, no information about the tool other than the names loaded here. So Claude has an idea of what tools are available. And this is where the naming of the MCP tools becomes really important, because this is kind of that first layer of progressive disclosure where it's going to make up its mind on what this tool probably is supposed to be used for and how it might use it. As this list grows, if you add more and more MCP servers, you will take up slightly more of the context window in this tool definition. But again, since we're only using the names here, it's pretty negligible compared to having the full tool descriptions and tool schemas. So in this example, I asked it a very specific question. I wanted to know how many customers had used my app. So it knew it had to query the database, and it saw that there's a Subagents MCP available. And because it sees all of the tool names, it just selected the exact tool that it saw, which would allow it to query the database since, again, it already knew exactly what it wanted to do. Interestingly, if you look at the tool result here, we don't actually get the full tool definition. We get the tool name back and a type of tool reference. So what's actually happening here is instead of returning the tool definition in a tool result block like normal, what the Claude Code harness does is it just goes back and injects it into the system message now. So it's loaded just like any other tool up here. And that way you don't really break how Claude understands its system prompt and instructions, which I think is super cool. So it's loaded up here just like all of the other tool definitions, except this time it's going to load the full definition, including the description and the required parameters. It requires a project ID, and Claude doesn't know the project ID yet, so it needs to list what projects are available. So in the very next step, as we'll see, it runs another search and selects this tool, which then again loads this tool into this system prompt. So to begin the conversation, these two tools were not here. They're injected later in the conversation, which I think is a really clever way to do it. So scrolling back down, we get that tool result for the first execute SQL tool. And then, like I said, it runs the search tool again, this time selecting the list projects tool, which now loads this tool definition into the context. Now it actually calls the list projects tool. And if we look here, this is the normal tool response. So this is going to be all of the project IDs. And then if we scroll down, now it knows what project IDs we have, and then we'll run the actual query and then get back real data. Really quick, if you are enjoying this video, please drop a like as it helps out my small channel a lot. And let me know in the comments, what other big issues do you have with Claude Code? Or what feature do you wish it really had? I'm really curious to hear your guys' thoughts, and I'll respond to all of the comments. So now I want to show you this in action. Let's hop back over to our Claude Code session here. Remember, we have enabled the search, so these are all loaded on demand, and our context window is clear of any MCP tool definitions. Can you tell me about SPR 89 and also see how many files we have in our Subagents storage? Okay, so we see a couple of MCP tool searches here, and one of them is to select the linear get project tool so it knows exactly what it wants to use there. But the other one, it's not sure. So it does a search, Subagents storage files. It loads the exact linear tool that I wanted to use. But for Subagents, it sees a maybe related tool called get logs, but it doesn't see anything for actually looking at the storage that I have in Subagents. So it realizes, hey, I need to actually just use the execute SQL tool. So that's an example where it wasn't sure what tool it needed. And so it did a search to try to load more of the tool definitions and read more about potentially related tools. Finally, it just decides that maybe it can execute SQL directly on the database and then find out what's in the storage. I won't go through the rest of this. Basically, it's just trying to figure out what the correct issue ID is and how to call this tool properly. It executes some SQL for Subagents, and eventually it is able to load SPR 89. So I guess I just gave it the wrong issue ID using voice, but it figures it out and it's able to load the correct issue. So here it can see my linear issue. And then it is able to eventually get the answer about the files I have in my Subagents storage. So we've used a few tools now. I want to now take a look at the context so we can compare it to what we saw in the trace earlier. Now you can see that there is a separate section for the MCP tools which were searched for and selected and are now loaded into the context. We now have 1.4 thousand tokens taken up by these MCP tools that weren't there before. So what happens as we continue this conversation and Claude calls more of these MCP tools? I'm going to ask it another question, and this time I want to specifically ask about Sentry so it calls a different tool that's not already loaded. Do we have any recent Sentry errors? So this time we should see another search tool called since it hasn't loaded this one. There it is. It selected the exact tool that it wants to use, and it looks like it had to load a second tool as well. So it needed to get the organization slug first. Now it's able to go ahead and call the tool and see what the issues are. And we got our final response. So we have 4 unresolved issues that are being tracked in Sentry. And now let's look at our context after calling a couple of additional tools from the Sentry server. We have 2 new tools, our 2 Sentry tools that are now loaded along with the other ones. As a session or conversation continues, any tool that has already been loaded stays loaded, and MCP tool token usage has now gone up from, I think it was 1.8 before, to 2.6 thousand tokens. So this accumulates over time. You can imagine if you're having a really long conversation with Claude and it's calling a bunch of MCP tools, this is going to continue to grow over time, this context usage. And I think it's worth exploring this design decision from Anthropic. We saw that when an MCP search tool is called, we don't get back the schema in the tool result, just a reference that that tool was loaded. And the tool definition then gets permanently added to the tool list now, just like how it worked before. And so that's why this list of loaded tools is going to accumulate longer and longer for longer conversations. And I think there's a few benefits to this design. One is that it already follows existing patterns. So it's putting the tool definition up top with the rest of the system tools. So it's easy for Claude Code to understand, and it doesn't have to go looking for tool schemas in the conversation history. The second benefit of loading the tool schema this way and not as a tool result is it's going to have better attention from Claude Code, since we know that with long context windows, things that are at the very beginning or at the very end of the context window tend to be remembered better. And typically the way Claude Code uses tools is it will call the same tool multiple times. So if you think about the web search tool or different file system tools, so it makes sense to keep the loaded tool in context for the rest of the session, because it's likely that that tool is going to be needed again and again. And then lastly, maybe not as important, but you can imagine if you had maybe a weaker model like Sonnet, or you have a really long conversation where at some point Claude called the search tool and then got back some tool schemas, but they're buried really deep in that long conversation history. And then, for whatever reason, it decides to call the search tool again and get back the same tool schema. It's going to be less efficient overall for your context window to have the same tool schemas loaded multiple times. Now, what do you think is going to happen if we compact at this point? Obviously, this isn't a realistic situation. We still have a ton of free space, but let's say we had a really long working session. We have a ton of MCP tools loaded, and it's time for us to compact this conversation. Let's see what happens to these loaded tools. Run a compact, and it should be relatively quick since it's a short conversation. Okay, so that finished. For some reason, it took like a minute and 20 seconds. I thought they fixed this, but there you go. Down here now shows that our token usage is 0. I'm going to now run context again. Notice that now we don't have any MCP tools loaded and no MCP tools taking up context. Now, again, this is just a design decision that Anthropic made. They could have chose to leave those tools that were already loaded, assuming that you're continuing a session or conversation and task, and you're probably going to be using the same tools. But I think this is actually a good way to do it, where they're instead not going to assume that Claude is going to be using the same tools. They clear the full context, so you get all of your context window back. And now it'll proceed as normal. If Claude decides to use one of those tools, it'll just load it again. Now, everything else as far as how MCPs work with skills, with subagents, etc., still works the same. So if you have skills or subagents, I'll just show you in this example. I have this issue picker, and I have specified that only these 4 tools are allowed. This is still respected. So everything else about the MCP tool permissions works the same. Finally, since so many of you did mention the Docker MCP Toolkit, I wanted to show you how this works with that. So now let's connect the Docker MCP Toolkit like before and see what that does to the MCP tools in the context. That should now be loaded. I'm going to start up a new Claude. And again, I'm getting this warning about settings. So if we look in /doctor, so before we just had our regular list of MCPs, and now you can see we have also MCP Docker with 89 tools, taking up an additional 22,000 tokens. So we're 2 times over the limit now. I'm going to go back and now take a look at our context. We have a lot of MCP tools, so this is taking a little while. Wow, 30 seconds in. I don't think it's ever taken me this long to run /context. Okay, finally, it's done. We have all of our MCPs, including all of the Docker MCPs. And voila, you could see that the lazy loading works for the Docker MCP Toolkit as well, which makes sense. It's just loaded via the same way of defining it in the mcp.json. So our context window is still clean of MCP servers. And this is a good example showing that you can have a mix of MCPs that you define yourself in your project level, at your user level, in MCP Docker Toolkit, and it's all going to work as expected. So that is everything I have to share for this video. I'm super excited with this new MCP search tool and the lazy loading of MCP servers. It's going to really improve the usage of MCPs and performance of agents like Claude Code when using a ton of MCPs, and really unlocks a lot if you think about it, because we can expose our agents now to so many more tools and not have it impact the context window. From the testing that I've done, it seems to perform really well since it has that list of available MCP tools. It's great because it has an idea up front of what capabilities it has. And I think the only other thing that you could do if you want to improve this system even more is to add some usage patterns or use cases for the different MCP servers in your Claude MD, or for example, in skills and subagents. But overall, I think this is a really awesome update from Anthropic. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about this update and new feature. That's going to do it for today's video. Thank you guys for watching. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.